I'm Fincina Hopgood. I am a sessional lecturer in the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne, and it was here that I completed my PhD on the portrayal of mental illness in Australian and New Zealand films. And I was very interested in exploring the relationship of empathy between characters living with mental illness and the audience.
So I'm a PhD student completing a thesis on the representation of women in Hollywood cinema. But because a lot of these representations of women who behave in very unconventional ways often get interpreted as being unbalanced psychologically, I have a strong interest in the way mental health is represented in film. So I approached Fincina in the hope that we might be able to put together a symposium that would examine this as one of its kind of key themes.
So very early on, we attached the framework of empathy to this idea of a symposium. And to try and sum up that concept, we basically came up with a very simple title called Try Walking in My Shoes. And really that sums up what we wanted the project to encapsulate, the ability of the audience member to try imaginatively to walk in another person's shoes. And even if it's not always successful, it's just the intention to empathise or to imagine yourself in another person's place, which is very powerful and has meaning. One of the things I was really keen for us to achieve with this event was moving the discussion of mental health portrayals beyond the negative. So the dominant literature, or the sort of the dominant trend in the literature up to that point, has been very much focused on stereotypes of mental illness on screen and the stigmatising effects of these negative portrayals. And that research is really important, and it's obviously important to understand the history of the portrayal of mental illness on screen up until where we are now today. But I think most people would agree that we're starting to see the development of more nuanced, sensitive, authentic portrayals, both in film and television. And so it was really important to us from the outset that our event be focusing on the more positive, constructive portrayals. And so what we were looking for was, I guess, a framework within which we could guide everyone's discussions.
One of the points I think that comes across in your research is that it's quite unusual to have a main protagonist in a film who is the central person that the viewer can identify with, but also empathise with, and that relationship is actually quite difficult to sustain and achieve.
Absolutely. Yeah. Basically to allow us to develop a more rich framework for understanding how empathy might operate between the viewer and the character on screen. Understanding that it isn't a simple thing of, having a point of view shot and a voiceover equals empathy. It's not, a mathematical equation when it comes to making a film. But I am interested in looking at the kinds of creative decisions that a filmmaker, a scriptwriter, an actor will be making when it comes to balancing empathy with also authenticity, because the challenge with the subject matter of mental illness, of course, is that you can have moments where your character is behaving in a way that other people will naturally turn away from and want to disconnect from and say, I don't share that perspective, or I don't share those emotions, or I don't wish to identify with a character who's going through a psychotic episode. So for the filmmaker to actually say, no, hang in there, we're providing you with a safe space to go on this emotional journey with this character, it's a degree of risk-taking on the part of the filmmaker. And it's an imaginative leap that the audience has to make to say, okay, I'm willing to stick with this character even if I think they're behaving in ways that I feel uncomfortable about. So we were fortunate, because we were members of the School of Culture and Communication, that we knew about the Centre for Excellence in the History of Emotions, which has a node here at the University of Melbourne. And we knew that there was a support scheme for events like conferences and symposia, etc. So it was with that in mind that we actually first approached the Centre for History of Emotion and said, we have this idea to get together all these people for a day or 2 days of discussions, workshops, papers, but we really need the support of an institution that has as its focus an interest in emotion and understands that we're going to explore this emotion of empathy through the sort of the media of film and television with a particular focus on mental health. So it was wonderful for us that Shay supported that mission. But we then needed another partner to join us, didn't we?
Exactly. And I think that's why the DAC Centre was just ideal, because they were really able to guide us in making sure that we did create an event that was sensitive to people who were sharing their stories about their lived experience. And clearly the DAC Centre does that from the perspective of artworks, and is clearly interested in doing that also from the perspective of filmmaking and film viewing as an experience. So having the DAC Centre to guide us through that was invaluable.
Absolutely. And it's been a wonderful marriage, I think, of interests and themes and missions between the organisations, between the School of Cultural Communication and its interest in film, between Centre for History of Emotion, its interest in the history of emotions and how they've changed or how they've stayed the same. And then, of course, for the DAC Centre, empathy is one of the key values that's in their mission statement. So it's a wonderful marriage between the three organisations.
We did a screening of the film The Sunny Boy, which looks at Jeremy Oxley, who's the lead singer of The Sunny Boy, and whose career basically as a musician was cut short due to his experience of schizophrenia. But being able to see just how personal his journey was with schizophrenia, how distinct it was to perhaps other people's experience of it, but also in particular that film, and this is one of the reasons why we included it in the symposium, is that it has a really positive outcome. Actually having a document of that journey and being able to see him move from a position of total dysfunction and marginalisation to a position of recovery that involves not a very simple process and no simple cure, no fast cures, but something that involved medication, something that involved re-establishing a relationship with his family. All of those aspects I think are really key, and unless we see those sorts of stories on film, it's going to be very difficult for people who haven't had experiences of mental illness to actually empathise with that.
But it can be challenging in those films where a character's journey doesn't end so positively. And one of the other screenings we had at the symposium, which was a very special event, was a screening of the film Romulus, My Father, based on the memoir written by Raymond Gator. We were very lucky to have Raymond Gator as one of our keynote speakers as well. So on our first day, we had Raymond talking earlier in the day about the limits of empathy, the fact that empathy can only go so far, and that there are times where empathy can be an unpleasant experience, quite a painful experience that people might recoil from or move away from. And the film, based on his memoir, is a really difficult text to get your head around, because you're looking at these characters at a time in Australian history, which is sort of the 1950s, 1960s, where socially a character dealing with mental illness was incredibly isolated and marginalised and misunderstood. And so the filmmakers have to be true to our historical time and portray that sense of isolation that a character such as Christina, who was based on Raymond Gator's mother, was feeling at that time with being misunderstood in terms of her mental illness. And it has to balance that kind of historical perspective with how a character like Christina might have been treated with our own modern day contemporary view of what we think Christina's situation might be. So Raymond spoke very sensitively about that tension that we have as an audience member, and from a contemporary perspective, wishing to understand Christina better, almost wishing to diagnose her and give her a label, but at a time where diagnosis and label was, inadequate or didn't exist. And the problems that presents for the filmmakers too, because it means that they don't have an overarching medical framework within which they can place her situation. So that leaves the audience to fill in the gaps. And we talked after the screening, Raymond spoke very openly after the screening about his concerns that the way she was portrayed in the film might make people take a certain negative view of her behaviour, because as a mother she's unable to care for her children. And he was concerned that that might have an audience member judging her harshly and saying she's a bad mother.
But I think that that's also part of what we were trying to do. It's the sense of empathy that we were talking about is something that people were actually experiencing in that screening.
Absolutely.
So while we were talking about how empathy is constructed, how it's achieved, how it might help people's journeys, I think that screening was actually an example of us all actually empathizing not only with that central character, but also in particular with Raymond's experience of having two parents who went through a difficult experience. It was clear that people who have had a lived experience of mental illness, film and talking about their experience on film can be a really therapeutic process for them, but it's also a way of destigmatizing their whole experience. That willingness to speak about it in such a public and outspoken manner. So to me it seemed clear that there is a real demand, not only from people from a lived experience, but also from mental health professionals, that they're really interested in exploring those representations more thoroughly, in a more kind of structured manner. So I think there is definitely a need to continue that discussion.
So we have given a lot of careful thought to sort of the legacy of this event, and we always envisage this event as ideally being the beginning of a series of ongoing conversations and collaborations, and indeed research projects. So Patricia and I are very keen to continue exploring this within our own research, beyond the PhD for Patricia and into postdoctoral work for me. And we've seen that work continuing in this kind of cross-disciplinary collaboration. We think that's really important for the conversation to be about bringing together our film scholarship with the insights of historians of emotion and with the insights of people with an expertise in mental health that we obviously don't have, and that's why we really appreciate the generosity of those mental health professionals and consumers for sharing their knowledge with us. So where we go to from here, we've got lots of ideas involving maybe another event, a form of publication, continuing to raise awareness and just continuing to collaborate. And we've really been pleasantly surprised by the sheer number of people who've come to us and saying, this is fantastic and we'd like to do more of it.